You're looking right now at overhead view of Helsinki, Finland, where Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will be meeting now. You just had the President of the United States talking in his introductory remarks about Vladimir Putin, said that they're going to be talking about trade, missiles, China, and our mutual friend, President Xi. Also, David Ignatius, the president, said we have great opportunities together. And the president believed that they could end up with, quote, an extraordinary relationship. Not surprising, but nothing was said about the U.S. government's uncovering of Vladimir Putin's attempt to disrupt American democracy, which was laid out before the American public and the rest of the world on Friday. What are your takeaways from those initial talks?
The body language was anything but confrontational. It was congenial. It was relaxed. Trump repeated the statement he often makes: talking with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. He clearly believes that. He laid out an agenda that, as I heard him, stressed more than I might have thought the question of nuclear weapons. He referred to it several times. He talked about the two great nuclear powers having such dominance in that area. That was a bad thing, not a good thing. That made me think that one subject that may be on tap here for the discussions is arms control. That's a good thing. The situation, the strategic instability between Russia and the United States over the last couple of years has been a cause for worry. But we saw Donald Trump kind of inviting a broad discussion, welcoming President Putin, saying that he hopes for an extraordinary relationship with him, and that it was a congenial mood of Helsinki. We'll begin to refer to this as, but for the first signs, that's the way the president wants to go.
And Richard Haas, David Ignatius brought up the congenial body language between these two gentlemen, though I was not a supporter of Barack Obama and had many problems with his foreign policy. I remember the first time Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin met. I remember being deeply offended as an American by how Vladimir Putin slumped in his chair, looked disinterested, and was clearly trying to throw Barack Obama, the American president, off of his game. Certainly, you saw none of that here. And you can, again, look at those past meetings with American presidents. And Vladimir Putin is a world leader who lets you know how he feels with his body language. This, again, based on their opening statements, though, certainly does seem like it is going to be a friendly meeting, or as Donald Trump calls it, a friendly summit.
I'm sure it will be. And the president used the phrase about, there's nothing wrong with the United States and Russia getting along. But that misunderstands American foreign policy. The purpose of foreign policy is not to get along with other governments. It's to try to influence their behavior in ways that are consistent with your interests. So whether there's a spirit of Helsinki is quite honestly irrelevant. Whether these two gentlemen, quote unquote, get along is irrelevant. The question is whether we see anything more responsible, more restrained from Russia and its aftermath. And I think David's right. There's a good chance that arms control will be the substantive centerpiece. The New START strategic nuclear agreement expires in a couple of years. The agreement covering shorter range systems is fraying. And this is something, one, that's important, but two, Russia would love. And the reason is arms control was something that was uniquely in the province of the United States and the Soviet Union. That's what made them superpowers. So to revive the U.S.-Russia now arms control relationship is a way of saying these two countries uniquely matter in ways that other doesn't. It's actually the one area where Russia can beat out China. So I think there's a decent chance that this will happen because Russia would love it, and it is objectively important.
Andrea, following up on that, one of the things that jumped out during that conversation that they both had with the news media is President Trump describing our nuclear power, both of our, Russia and the United States, describing in detail that the two countries can hold 90% of the nuclear capacity, nuclear missiles in the world, and he referred to it as a bad thing, quote unquote, a bad thing. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I think that this is the way that the president is seizing on one thing that could come out of that summit today that he thinks is a good thing for him, for his legacy, for the United States, to resume arms control talks with the former Soviet Union, with Russia, and to reduce arms down the road, to talk about lowering the level of arms in an extension of that START arms control agreement that is going to expire in a couple of years. As Richard says, this puts him and Vladimir Putin on an equal level, and we don't want Vladimir Putin to be on an equal level with the President of the United States because he's been such a bad actor. But it is one thing that they could agree on, and one deliverable, if you will, of this very unscripted summit that has no agenda. What you did not see is any kind of posture in either the body language or the literal language where he is suggesting that he will take on Vladimir Putin in any way. It was as friendly an opening session for this one-on-one as you could possibly imagine, talking about how relations have not been very good, but it would be a good thing if they were improved. That would not be a bad thing. The kind of rhetoric he has used in the run-up to this summit, and the fact that he talks about everything but cyber attacks. He talks about nuclear missiles, and he talks about trade, and about China, and their mutual friend, President Xi. He's talking about the world at large, but not talking about Europe, NATO, and the other things that are essential in Europe and the rest of the world. So it's not a very auspicious beginning for anyone who had hoped that the president would be at least addressing the Mueller probe in anything like an aggressive posture based on the evidence that was alleged in that indictment. That is not going to happen.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.